This is the KC Show. I'm Kyle Cushman, and welcome into part 2 of our Team by Team podcast series, diving into every PWHL squad before the season opener on November 21st. First off, we did the Boston Fleet. Next up today is, of course, the Montreal Victoire. If you couldn't tell, I guess you can't really see the logo. I'm wearing the Marie-Philippe Poulin jersey. Fitting timing as well after Vladdy wore the Poulin Team Canada jersey before Game 7. Still reeling from that loss, but we march on, and I'm really excited for this edition of the series today. First Canadian team of the series, if you couldn't tell, based off of going Montreal second, going to be going back and forth between the American and the Canadian teams. So first up on the Canadian slot is Montreal, coming off of another heartbreaking loss in, I guess, the first round, but really what should be called the semifinals of the PWHL playoffs, being the top team in the regular season, deciding to play against the Ottawa Charge in the semifinals and losing in 4 games in that series. Of course, in year 1, going up against the Boston Fleet and losing that one in 3 games. It was a heartbreaking loss, to say the least, one where you really felt this overwhelming sense of dread coming from the Victoire after that defeat. You had Marie-Philippe Poulin saying that the team needs to look in the mirror after the second straight playoff loss. You had lots of players very emotional, knowing that that group would be very different going into the season, and it is a very different group coming into the season. And yet, despite all of the playoff heartbreak from the spring and all the heartbreak over the last 2 years, when you go back to the year 1 playoffs as well, I do think that there's a lot of reason for optimism coming into this season for the Montreal Victoire. In fact, we're going to get into the ins and outs in a moment here, but I think there's a very real case to be made that this team is better than the team they had last year, despite the expansion draft, which I don't know if there's any other established team that can say that at this point. I know I was talking with Jared Book at the draft in Ottawa, and it's something that he noted at the time, but having sat on it throughout the entire summer and now into the fall and looking at the roster and looking at everything that's changed around the Montreal Victoire, I'm totally bought into that. I look at this roster from top to bottom, and yes, there are some different weaknesses or some different strengths and all of that, but I look at this roster as a whole and I see fewer flaws than the team that they had last year. So I'm super excited to dive into all of that and much more on this very fun second edition of the PWHL Team by Team podcast series we're doing here. Let's begin by looking at the players that are in and out from last year's squad, leaving the team in the summer, quite a few players, and a lot of them coming from the past draft that Montreal had, and which was one of the top drafts in 2024. Out Jen Gardner in expansion, as well as Abby Boreen, signing in the free agent period, Claire Dalton, Michaela Grant-Mentis, and Claire DeGeorge, and then the big offseason trade, of course, Kristen O'Neill heading out from the forward group as well. On the back end, basically everybody outside of the top 2 pairings, not quite exactly, but Kayla Barnes gone in the expansion process, as well as Anna Wilgren, Mariah Keppel leaving in free agency, and Dominika Leskova, who was injured for much of her Montreal tenure. She elects to go back to Sweden this season. And then goaltender Elaine Chuli looking for some more starts. She left in free agency to go to the Toronto Scepters. But much more exciting than talking about the players that are gone for Montreal fans is talking about the wealth of talent that has been added to this roster. We talked about the Kristen O'Neill trade. Well, coming in the other way from that trade, Abby Roque, as well as in free agency, Haley Scamurra, Cheyenne Darkangelo, Jay Downey Landry, and then in the draft, Natalie Malinkova, Skylar Irving, and Maya Labelle, all up front. And then on the back end, all in free agency, Jessica DiGirolamo and Maggie Flaherty, just the 2 in free agency there. And then in the draft process, first round pick Nicole Gosling, as well as late round intriguing talent Tamara Giacinto. No current additions made between the pipes. Likely Trisha DeGuire, I expect to be signed at some point, either as a reserve or as that third string goaltender on the roster. Okay, so with that being said, I'm actually going to get to a lot of these additions throughout this episode, so I'm not going to highlight any at this moment. I'm just going to continue right on into my 5 big questions for the Montreal Victoire this season. The first one, and probably the one that everyone knows, can they finally break through in the playoffs? It was borderline painful watching the amount of chances and shots created by Poulin and Stacey in that first round series against the Ottawa Charge, and only had 1 goal each to show for it. I believe the final total was 55 shots between the two over 4 games. Yeah, 55 shots on goal over 4 games for Poulin and Stacey, and yet each of them only scored 1 goal each in the series. That's just numbers that you don't see from those two players ever, and yet we've seen them back-to-back years in the playoffs. It's something where you can chalk it up to just running into hot goaltending when you look at both Aaron Frankel's performance in 24 and Gwyneth Phillips in 25. But having it happen back-to-back years and in such extreme fashion, there's more to it than that. And a lot of it, to me, comes down to the lack of supplementary offense that this team has been getting. So much was talked about in 24 about the usage for depth players by Corey Cheverie, especially in those long overtime games where like Aaron Ambrose was playing over an hour and Poulin and Stacey were playing huge minutes, and so many players were being relied on in such heavy usage, and then the bottom of the lineup players were barely playing 2-3 shifts in the entire game. And it wasn't as extreme this year, but there was still a lack of offense from the rest of the lineup. Like, you could look at the rest of the forward lineup and like a lot of the players, and a lot of those players got decent minutes in that super long overtime game. But none of them really showed enough offensively to really be those threats that can actually get you that goal, which is funny to say because Montreal actually won that marathon game with Kath Dubois scoring the goal. But outside of players like Dubois, in the entire bottom 9, outside of the first line, how many players were there on that roster that you truly believed in to actually break through offensively? Abby Boreen had her moments early on in the season, but I don't think she was as effective as the season went along. Kristen O'Neill really never got going offensively in Montreal. And you look all around the lineup, and basically a 13th extra forward from Toronto in Caitlin Willoughby, a player that I really, really like as a 13th forward or a 4th liner, was playing basically a second line role for much of the playoffs. And I love her speed. I love her tenacity. I love her work ethic. She is one of the great role models, I think, in the entire PWHL for a player that not only can build out a role for themselves based off of their skill set, but also is truly just a role model, is somebody that anyone should look up to, considering her work in the offseason as a nurse and then as a pro hockey player during the season. I think she's a remarkable person. But she's not somebody that should be playing in a top 6 role for a team that has championship ambitions. I think that's just the reality of things for a player like Caitlin Willoughby. And so much attention gets paid to the top of this Victoire lineup, and rightfully so, but they can't do it alone, and it's been shown that way over 2 seasons now. So if they can finally break through in the playoffs, sure, it's going to need Poulin and Stacey and Aaron Ambrose and all those top players to actually put the puck in the back of the net a couple more times in the playoffs, but it's also going to need to be a couple more players step up in those supplementary roles, and it can't just be all on Poulin and Stacey to put up 55 shots over 4 games and rely on them to try and score you 7 to 10 goals in that kind of series. That's just, as much as those players can do that, it's just not realistic to lean on them in such a heavy way. And I think the Victoire over the past 2 years have done a good job of identifying those issues that they had in the first postseason run, and then again last year in this most recent offseason. And I think they've done a good job of trying to address those woes, and we'll see how it goes into the season and into the playoffs and everything like that. But I'm intrigued by this roster, and I'm hopeful for this roster to be better in those areas going into the playoffs, specifically with the kind of talents that they picked up in the offseason. They got a lot of players that are bigger, harder to play against, play with some grit, but have an offensive punch behind them. It's not just grit for nothing. There's a good offensive punch to the players that they brought in this season. And again, you go back to that list that I mentioned earlier in the show about the players that are gone up front and the players that have been added up front. And I think there's more offense being brought in than in terms of what left in the offseason. Even though that there are some intriguing young players that left, I think overall the free agency moves and the draft moves made by general manager Daniel Sauvageau, I think put them in a good place to, at least on paper, be a team that is improved come postseason time. Now, not only do you have to make it there, you also have to prove that you're a better team in the playoffs, and we won't know that until the spring. But I feel very good about this roster to at least not go out in the same way that they have in the last two seasons in the semifinals. They could absolutely still lose in the semifinals. That is very much a reality that could happen here. But looking at this roster in terms of the additions made and the changes made, I think if they lose in the first round, it won't be down to an emphasis being played to the top of the lineup and a lack of scoring threat, at least, throughout the rest of the lineup. Moving on to my second question, do Poulin and Stacey play on the same line? So again, going back to the conversation about the top line, and come playoff time, they've experimented very minimally with splitting up Stacey and Poulin on separate lines. But come playoff time, it has pretty consistently been Poulin and Stacey on the same line. And there's a reason to it. They have so much chemistry on the ice. They work well in terms of Stacey's power forward mentality, her shot generation, Poulin's shot generation, but playmaking as well. And they work so well off of each other in terms of being this dominant offensive force. But when you're a team that has had some scoring woes, at least in terms of your depth, does it make sense to split those two up in your roster and try to have a more balanced top six rather than the loaded up top six? It's something that I would heavily consider at least starting the season with. But when you also look to the Olympics in a few months' time, they're probably going to be playing on the same line there. Do you want them playing on the same line leading up to that? Maybe experiment with it at the end of the season? I'm not quite sure the way you go about it, but I would heavily consider having Poulin and Stacey on different lines this season because of the talent around them. I think you can make a first line that is similarly effective with different pieces on the first line around Poulin, and then have a second line that has a much greater threat because of Stacey's presence there without her relying, or I shouldn't say relying, without her having Poulin at center. I think those two can drive separate lines and give you a more well-rounded top six that make you a more dangerous team, even if the most dangerous individual line would be with Stacey and Poulin on the same line. And of course, you can go to that combination late in games when you need to, but I think for the most part, the Victoire should look to at least start the season with Poulin and Stacey on different lines and give that a legitimate run with the amount of talent that is now in this forward group. My third question is related to that first one, and we talked about the breaking through in the playoffs and the forward depth thing. Well, my third question is, quite simply, is the forward depth finally fixed? You look over the 2 years for the Victoire, and the forward depth has been a significant issue in terms of year one, that big split between the trusted players and the bottom of the lineup that just simply wasn't trusted. And then in the playoffs, only scoring 4 total goals in that 3-game series. And then even in the regular season, Poulin and Stacey scoring double-digit goals, and then the next highest goal scorers having 5 goals each, which is kind of crazy to look back at because Teresa Vinisheva was on that team and scored 2 goals in 17 games before being traded. There was good talent on that team in the bottom 6, second line, things like that, but they didn't get enough production from the bottom of the lineup. And again, last year, even though it was improved, there was more talent in the bottom areas of the roster up front. There was more scoring threat in the bottom parts of the roster in secondary supplementary roles. It was still a stark difference between Poulin and Stacey and the rest of the team in terms of actual goal scoring. You look at the final totals, Poulin with 19 goals, Stacey with 11 goals. The next highest player was Bourine with 6 goals and Dubois with 6 goals. They just need a little bit more from the bottom of their roster. And then in the playoffs, it was just, you didn't get enough. Maureen Murphy, again, having some good moments in the playoffs, But then Kristen O'Neill with 1 goal, Poulin and Stacey, as I mentioned, with 1 goal, Dubois with the 1 overtime winner. But you don't get anything from any other players in the playoffs. You need some of those players to step up in those moments if you're going to be successful in the playoffs. And for me, I look at the forward depth now, and it's very exciting. Between the additions of Abby Roque, who's an improved offensive player over somebody like Kristen O'Neill, Haley Scamurra, somebody that has been snake bitten in the PWHL, but somebody that has a high shot generation, and I think somebody who, in the right role, could actually be a surprising offensive player this upcoming season. Cheyenne Darkangelo coming off of a huge breakout season, and then young offensive talented players like Malinkova and Ljungblom. And Irving and Murphy, and then some of the veteran depth like Dubois, who's a very good offensive player. And all of that mixed together gives me excitement and makes me believe in their ability to get more scoring throughout the lineup. But again, you kind of look at last year's roster and you might have thought the same thing, at least at a certain point. But I do think overall this is a better offensive group up front. And that has been so much of the issue for the Victoire, is just getting a couple more goals from the rest of the lineup. And then obviously in the playoffs, it's been getting any goals from anyone, really. But I think overall this group is deeper, or the deepest forward group that the Victoire have had in their young history. And it makes me excited that the forward depth issue is finally fixed for Montreal. My next question, again related to the previous one. Can Cheyenne Darkangelo maintain her form from last season? And in terms of it being related to the previous question, I think if the answer is yes to that, then the forward depth is easily, without a doubt, improved for the Victoire. If it's not the case, then I think it's more of a question of whether the forward depth actually is improved. I still lean yes, but let's get into Darkangelo here individually. 8 goals, 17 points in 29 games last year with 53 shots on goal. 15% shooting percentage, that'll probably drop a little bit, but overall a center that proved to be legit top 6 presence for the Ottawa Charge and was somebody that was leaned on pretty heavily over the course of the latter part of the season. The previous season for Darkangelo, 24 games, 0 goals, 1 assist, and 30 shots on goal, was traded at the trade deadline from Boston to Ottawa, of course, and had no points in her 7 games that season with Ottawa. There was no individual player that was more improved last season in terms of just raw production than Darkangelo, going from that 1 assist in 24 games to 8 goals and 17 points in 29 games the season afterwards. She did shoot 15%, like I mentioned there, and that is something that will come down. But I look at her skill set and her ability as this center with some size and some offensive ability, and she adds so much down the middle to the Victoire. I've got her penciled in as the second line center. We're going to get to that at the end here. But for Darkangelo, if she can maintain that, that makes her a very valuable piece for this Victoire team, because they haven't had a center like this behind Poulin ever. It was supposed to be Kristen O'Neill, and O'Neill struggled to find her groove offensively, being leaned on in very heavy defensive minutes and some things like that. But you just needed more from her offensively, and they never really got it. But you look at the role that Darkangelo played, and yes, she only scored the 1 goal in the playoffs coming in that season, or that playoff opener, and then didn't find the score sheet again afterwards. But you look at the role she played, playing over 16 minutes in every single playoff game, playing over 20 minutes in every game in the final. And I just think that she's somebody that gives a very different profile down the middle for the Victoire than what they've had to this point in their history. And again, if she can maintain that form, scoring 8-ish goals and 15-ish points, I think that's somebody that is extremely valuable down the middle. Now, she could also shift to the wing, and Abby Roque could play center, and there's a lot of different things that you could do there. You could have Darkangelo up on the top line with Poulin, potentially. There's a lot of different things you could do with Darkangelo in this top 6, but that's reliant on her maintaining that offensive form from last year to be a player that can actually be in the top 6. So I think coming off of a season where things were so stark, starkly different offensively for her, going from that 1 assist in 24 games to the 8 goals and 17 points the season afterwards. There's probably somewhere in the middle that is the true season that we're going to see from Darkangelo. But if she can repeat that kind of performance from last year, which I'm sure Montreal is going to be hoping for, that just adds a different level of depth and a versatile player that you can play in a bunch of different areas in the top 9, in the top 6 for Montreal, that really give them a different flavor of offensive depth that they just have not had. And my final big question is kind of looking a little more big picture, because this year is so unique with the league season and then the Olympics and then coming back from that and all the stress that's going to go into all of that. And given the players that are involved here for Montreal, stress probably isn't the right word to use, but it's hard to believe that the Olympics won't have some kind of impact on this team overall, either before the Olympics in terms of players trying to ramp up for February, in terms of after the Olympics, where players that have gone to the Olympics year over year, or I should say quadrennial over quadrennial, aren't necessarily used to coming back and playing in this kind of pro environment. How does that alter things? And then I think ultimately, how does the Olympic outcome in terms of who wins gold and who doesn't impact things the rest of the PWHL season? For example, and I might have to revoke my Canadian citizenship to say this momentarily here, as I guess I should turn my head this way, the Poulin overtime goal in Sochi behind me. If Canada doesn't win gold, what kind of Poulin do we see after that? Is it a Poulin that is another level of just fired up? Is it another level of fired up to go and win the Walter Cup if they do win gold? Like, what does that look like? What does that look like for coming off of such a high at the Olympics, or such a low if they lose, they being Team Canada, and coming back to the professional environment? What does that look like? We just haven't seen these things for these kinds of players, and we haven't seen them even in the men's game in ages as well. It's something that will be a first-time experience for a lot of these players, and it's something I'm very interested to see specifically for this Montreal team, because there's lots of players around the league that have the big spotlights when it comes to the Olympics, and every team has Olympians that will be going to the games and playing those and getting that similar experience. But I don't think there's any team that has the Poulin and Stacey and Ambrose and Desbiens, that huge mix of such that key core of Team Canada going to the Olympics and then coming back, and how that impacts the rest of the season. I'm very curious to see how that aspect impacts that final stretch run for the Victoire this season, and how that impacts maybe the hunger, the drive, the energy levels, all of that going into the Walter Cup playoffs next season. Okay, let's get to your questions now, beginning with Jason Trejo-Risky on Twitter asking, of all the players lost during expansion and free agency, whose departure will hurt the Victoire the most this season? I think a lot of people might look to Jen Gardner here, because she was the Rookie of the Year finalist. She was an offensive real surprise, I think, last season, just her chemistry on the top line, and then at the World Championships, her play alongside Poulin and Stacey. But I'm actually going to say Kayla Barnes here, because Gardner, as good as she was in that top role, I think she's more replaceable than somebody like Kayla Barnes, who I believe to be a true top pairing defender, an Olympian, somebody that is going to the Olympics again this upcoming year. That's just not really somebody that you can replace in your top 4. And I think having that right-handed 1-2 punch of Ambrose and then Barnes, that is a level of defensive depth that you just can't replace. And I really like what they did in free agency and in the draft in terms of getting Gosling and DiGirolamo and having Katie Tabin still there, all of that. But I think overall, the defensive depth that is lost in Kayla Barnes, in terms of the high-end player there, in terms of the player that she is now, and in terms of the top pairing player that she can be, in terms of somebody that you can lean on to play 24, 25 minutes a game very easily, I think that is a kind of loss that outweighs the kind of offensive production of somebody like Gardner because of the more complementary role that I think she played in the top 6 overall. From Arctic Fox Pads on Twitter, asking, how good will Nicole Gosling realistically be her first year? Well, I think the best way to project rookie performance is to, look at rookie performance in the past. In year 1 of the PWHL, Sophie Jakes led all defenders in scoring with 10 points in 22 games. Of course, she was traded in that season. There's some weird stuff with that. But again, a slower start had to find her game in the PWHL. Ashton Bell, 7 points in 24 games. And really, I don't think anyone else with kind of the high-end echelon or experience of Nicole Gosling there to really compare to. So then let's look to last season, where Kayla Barnes, the Victoire defender, Victoire defender, led all defenders in scoring with all rookie defenders in scoring with 13 points in 30 games, played a huge top 4 role, played well over 20 minutes many nights. After that, not really any defenders in Nicole Gosling's echelon. Anna Wilgner had a fantastic season, paired a lot with Kayla Barnes. Nicole Gosling is in a different tier than Anna Wilgren. Maya Nyland Persson, who I think is a really talented Swedish young defender, not in the same tier as Nicole Gosling. So if you look at those top tier offensive defenders coming from college to the PWHL, making that transition straight to the league, so far the top end players have scored from 7 to 13 points in that range. And that's exactly the range that I'm looking for Nicole Gosling. I think a successful rookie season for her is about the 10-point mark if she's playing all 30 games, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on the role that she plays on the power play and depending on whether she plays on the top pairing with Erin Ambrose. If they go back to the Taben-Ambrose pairing, which is what I would personally do, I think that opens her up actually for more offense, because she's not going to be playing against those top opponents and get some of those better secondary matchups in that second pairing role. And if she is playing in that secondary role, maybe she can get closer towards that half point per game mark, which would be a very, very good mark to make as a rookie. I think ultimately she ends up being a little bit shy of that. I'll project her for 12 points this upcoming year if she plays the full 30-game campaign. I love her skating. I love her offensive skill. I think she's going to bring a lot to this Victoire back end from the offensive side of the blue line. And I think she's going to get some serious play on power play 2, maybe get a look on power play 1, depending on what they want from the power play quarterback there. I'm curious to see how that goes. But I think realistically, looking at like power play 2 type of thing and maybe a bit more of an offensive role in at 5-on-5 play. So I will project her for 12 points in that rookie season. I think she's somebody that can definitely play well over 20 minutes per night. She's somebody that has already made a world championship for Team Canada. She's somebody that is on the Olympic radar. She's on the Olympic orientation roster. She's somebody that with a very strong start to the PWHL season, I think is somebody that could realistically push to make one of those 7 slots for Team Canada. But overall, looking at the realistic outcome, just given some of the adjustments that some of the collegiate defenders have had to make going to the pro game, as much as I like Nicole Gosling's game, I'll project her for a more realistic projection of like 12 points, playing like 21 minutes per game. From Azoo Blue on Twitter, what do you think their X factor will or could be? So the combination of the better offensive depth up front, I think, is combined with very intriguing defensive depth on the back end. And in terms of just like a team X factor, I think the X factor is the overall team defense in terms of how good that unit is. I look at all 6 defenders there, and I think that's a group that can be a very strong group of 6. That can give you a little bit of offense, but is also going to be very strong defensively, led at the top, of course, by Erin Ambrose. But if we're talking about an individual player that I think is an X factor, look no further than Katie Taben. This is a player that has sky-high potential in this league. And I've got a very fun story coming up later this week that might touch on this a little bit on the score. That's a little bit of a tease for you guys coming up here. Katie Taben is a remarkable story. She is somebody that was away from the game for 2 years playing, came back in the PHF, immediately was a top defender there, and over 2 years in the PWHL has established herself as a legit two-way force in terms of her defensive ability, but also being a legit shot threat offensively. And as that just kind of upward curve of confidence is continued on for Taven, I think she's in store for a huge season. I think she's somebody that, with her skating ability and physicality and continued confidence, and now this experience with the rivalry series and it coming into that this week, and also her experiences overall at all these Olympic training blocks, I think the sky's the limit for her in terms of her makeup. Like, you look at the top defenders in the league and they all have the same characteristics as what Katie Taven has in terms of the skating profile, the size profile, the physicality profile, all of it that you want in that top defender in this league. Katie Taven has the ability to get to that point if she isn't well on her way to doing that already. I think if this season she takes another step and becomes more of an offensive presence, in addition to already being a great defensive presence, doing that on a top pairing with Erin Ambrose, which I project her to do, all of a sudden, if she can take that step, it goes from one of the top defense pairings in the league to maybe the best defense pairing in the entire league. So I think if Taven can take that next step, she can be that true X factor, because this group is already very strong overall, of course, coming off of the first place in the regular season, the playoff heartbreak, all of that. But I think if, with Nicole Gosling being on this roster, if you have a third legit number one defender kind of establish themselves, as Katie Taven looks to do in terms of her profile and in terms of the results that she's had these couple of seasons, if she can tick that up a notch and become one of those players that is regarded as one of the legit biggest difference makers in the league from the back end, again, something that I think is well within her ability to do, I think that completely transforms the outlook for the Victoire in terms of being this very good team that might have an extra hole on the back end now, not having as well-rounded of a top four with that excellent second pairing of Wilgren and Barnes being gone and Keppel being gone as well. And all of a sudden you have like two number one defenders in Ambrose and Taven, and then you have a young gun coming up in Gosling and another intriguing player in DiGirolamo, and all of this coming together. I think there's a way that Katie Taven really establishes herself as one of the premier defenders in the PWHL this season. And for that reason, I have her as the biggest X factor for Montreal this upcoming year. From Gabrielle VX and Striatic on YouTube, sorry if I mispronounced your username there, Brian. Where will Abby Roque fit on this roster? Fascinating question here, because I can see it on the left wing, on the right wing, at center, on the top line, on the second line, so many different ways that Abby Roque can be deployed. For me, looking at what happened the last 2 years in New York, Roque was a fantastic power play player who struggled at 5-on-5 defensively, but was great at the faceoff dot. That combination to me screams Marie-Philippe Poulin winger. And for that reason, I look at that Stacey spot at first line right wing. And if you want to split up Poulin and Stacey in terms of having them on different lines, I think Roque is that perfect fit to be on that same line as her and bring that just pesky, annoying, physical presence on the forecheck as well that could be a dynamite fit with Marie-Philippe Poulin. In terms of what I would like to see, I would like to see Roque on the wing, gives her less defensive responsibility down versus playing center, because that's something that's been an issue the last 2 years in New York. The 5-on-5 defensive game has been an issue. And because of that, I really like the idea of having her with that left-handed center so she can take those right side draws as well, because she's been fantastic at the faceoff dot in her PWHL career. So that's what I would look to do. I could also see her sliding into that second line center role if you supplement her with a couple more defensive wingers potentially. But for me, I would love to see her on that top line, give Poulin somebody very different that she's never played with, of course, in Roque. Two players that seem like oil and water a little bit when they've played against each other, but could gel perfectly on this kind of new look top pair or top line that I would love to see this upcoming year. Another one from Gabrielle_VX on Instagram asking about the new coaching staff addition full-time at least. What will Caroline Ouellette bring to the bench? Well, a lot is the simple answer because it's Caroline Ouellette. If I look across my setup right here to my 2014 gold medal championship poster that I've had since 2014, well, that means Ouellette with the C on her chest at the 2014 games has been on my wall for over a decade. That's the kind of person that you're bringing onto the staff. And she's been on the staff before, but this is as a full-time coach as an assistant on Corey Cheverie's coaching staff versus that kind of part-time role with her full-time role still being at Concordia. Being an Olympic year, I think it's great that Ouellette is going to be embedded in the Victoire full-time going into that Olympics. And I think she brings a lot. It goes almost overlooked in terms of her defensive game. Like, she played in Olympics as a defender. I think she brings a lot to the defense group in terms of coaching that side of things. And then, of course, her offensive game in terms of what she can coach on that side of things. I think she's a great person to have alongside Cheverie on a full-time basis. And I think she brings a lot to this coaching staff. I think if she wants to be a head coach in the future, she's somebody that can absolutely be a head coach in the PWHL in the future. I think she's somebody to look at as a candidate to be Canada's next women's national team head coach, along with somebody like Corey Cheverie. The coaching future for Caroline Ouellette is very, very bright, and I'm very excited to see her take the step from Concordia, which is a great program, but a dominant program there, and make the jump to the pros and live that life day in, day out with the Victoire. I think it's going to be mutually beneficial for both Ouellette's development as a coach and also for the Victoire in terms of what they're getting out of Ouellette having her on the coaching staff. From Orange Fly on Instagram, what role will Hayley Scamurra be playing on the team? There's already a lot of left wing and center depth. So when it comes to Hayley Scamurra, first and foremost, she hasn't played center at all in the PWHL. She's played both wings a little bit, but again, being that left-handed shot, she's more primarily a left winger. She's somebody that I'm very high on in this league, actually. I look at her game and her forechecking ability, her defensive prowess, and her shot generation. And I think she's somebody that has been very snake bitten in the PWHL. It took a long time for her to finally break through and get that first goal last season. The bounces just weren't going her way last season with the Scepters. And you think about that playoff breakaway she had. I think it was in game 4. I can't remember when it was. But she had an overtime breakaway, I think it was, and just missed on that opportunity. And if she was just getting the bounces to go her way with her shot generation, she's somebody that I think could pop an offensive number that maybe some people aren't expecting this year, especially if she plays the role that I would personally play her in, which is in a top 6 complementary forechecking role. She's somebody that is still on the Olympic radar and in the Olympic mix for Team USA and has been a stalwart on the fourth lines and kind of bottom parts of those lineups. And I don't think that's the best role for her in the PWHL because I think she's just better than playing this kind of fourth line role. And I look at her being this kind of great complementary piece alongside a lot of different players in that potential top 6. There are a lot of good wingers potentially on this roster. Like you look at the Laura Stacey and Abby Roque at the top of the list, of course. If let's pencil in one of Roque or Darkangelo on the wing. So that's 2 wingers already taken there. You have Malinkova through the draft coming in. You have Lena Ljungblom there. You have Maureen Murphy, who's played a lot on the wing here. You have Dubois and Downey Landry, who's played a lot on the wing. Like, you have a lot of players there. And so I understand the question in terms of there's a lot of like left wingers in particular there. There's going to be a couple of left wingers that play on the right side. It might be Scamurra as one of them. But overall, for me, I really like the addition as a bet on a player that if she put up the kind of goal totals that her shot generation should result in, she's probably not somebody that's available in free agency or through trade or anything that she was the past year. So I really like the addition of Scamurra, specifically her fit on this roster. And yeah, I think that she's going to play a complementary top 6 role, at the very least, a kind of third line checking role, certainly. Question from you guys from Striatic on YouTube. Is Corey Cheverie on the hot seat despite being named Coach of the Year? No, for me. I look at the history of Sauvageau and Cheverie, what they did in the PWHBA together, their history recently in the PWHL, and I look at the way that Sauvageau vouched for Cheverie after the playoff loss, and I just don't see this relationship ending, at least anytime soon. I look at Cheverie and her role on the Canadian national team. I look at her as one of the top candidates to be the future successor, whenever that is, for Troy Ryan as the head coach of the team. I look at what she's done in the regular season and the success that the Victoire have had there. Yes, the playoffs have not gone well, but I think some of that is almost a little bit more of the roster flaws versus some of the coaching specific things that Cheverie has done. But at the end of the day, you do need to get the results. In terms of Montreal potentially moving on from Cheverie, I think it would take a lackluster regular season, either missing the playoffs or going into the playoffs and having things go disastrously, like worse than the last 2 years, for that partnership to end. Because I think there's so much respect from the top players and from the management and everybody involved in terms of what Cheverie is as a head coach. And the only way that I see it changing is if the team being Sauvageau, feels that there's an upgrade to be made at the head coaching position. And would that be if somebody like a Caroline Ouellette stepped into a head coaching position? I don't know if that's the case. So for me, no, I don't think she's on the hot seat. I certainly understand why some people think that and why you look at the 2 first-round exits and why you would believe that she's on the hot seat. But I look at the Toronto Scepters and I look at the relationship that Gina Kingsbury and Troy Ryan have as GM and head coach, and I view that fairly similarly to the Sauvageau-Cheverie relationship. And Toronto coming off of, so again, the kind of same thing as back-to-back first-round exits. But I don't think anyone thinks Troy Ryan is on the hot seat because of that partnership with Gina Kingsbury as the general manager. And for me, I view it the same way in Montreal. I wouldn't have her on the hot seat. I think Cheverie is a fantastic coach. I think she's a right coach for this kind of group. And I think we're going to see it with this roster overall, them get the most out of this roster this upcoming year with hopefully that more trusted depth, some more offensive depth throughout the lineup. And I think ultimately that's going to lead to more success overall for Montreal. So yeah, I don't view Corey Cheverie as being on the hot seat coming off of that Coach of the Year title at all. All right, next up, my gals. I love doing it last time with the Boston Fleet. We're doing it again. I've got another 3 for you here. If you didn't check out that first Boston Fleet episode, well, first of all, go out and check it after the show. But my gals is simply players that maybe don't get the same kind of shine as the star players around the league, but players that I either particularly believe in to either step into higher roles or players that I just really appreciate watching. Players that I think can be impactful at the bottom of your lineup, or if given the opportunity, can maybe show more than expected in a top 6 role or a top 4 role or whatever it may be. So I've got 2 forwards and 1 defender here, beginning with a player that I think went undervalued in the entry draft, and that's Skylar Irving, who was one of my favorite, if not my favorite player in the draft last year. I had her as a fringe first round grade, to be completely honest. I would have considered taking her as early as like the 8th overall pick. She ended up going 20th overall. She's a right-handed center who might shift to the wing, could play down the middle. But again, that coveted right-handed shot, who was a near point per game at Northeastern the last 2 seasons after the departures of Alina Mueller and Chloe Orard and Maureen Murphy from that program in 2023. She's somebody that, again, learned from those players for her first 2 seasons at Northeastern and then got to blossom in that bigger role after they all departed the program. Why did I have her as a first-round grade or that fringe first-round grade? Well, I look at this combination of her speed, skill, and a really deceptive, lethal shot. You watch her mixtape in terms of the highlights she generated, the goals and assists she generated last season. So many times she was able to generate speed through the neutral zone, drive wide, beat a defender wide, and then drive to the net and get a puck home, or loop around the zone and find a passing lane or find a shot lane and got a puck through. And it's not like she was just doing that against bottom feeder teams. One thing that I particularly tried to do at the end of each NCAA year is pick out the results against the top teams, looking at teams that finished the season ranked in the top 15 and players' performances against those top 15 teams. Those teams that Skylar Irving played against last season were Penn State, Quinnipiac, and then in Hockey East in conference, Boston University, Boston College, and UConn. And against those 5 teams, she put up 9 goals and 19 points in 17 games. Those are numbers that are up there with the WCHA players in terms of those top results against those top end teams. And of course, there's a gap between some of the WCHA teams and some of those players and the quality teams that they're playing against versus some of the Hockey East teams that somebody like Irving is playing against. But against the top competition that she had to face last year, you can't control the teams that you play against with your program. You can only just go out and perform against those top teams that you are playing against. And against those 5 top teams that she was playing against last season, her results were excellent. So that immediately makes her a really intriguing target for me. And then you talked about the speed and the skill and the shot and the way that she was able to create that offense. Those are game breaker characteristics. And then the cherry on top for me, it's just the damn swagger that she plays with. She loves playing the game of hockey. You love watching her play the game of hockey because of the passion, because of the excitement, because of the swagger that she plays with. That's a player that when she scores, she loves to celebrate. She's a player that plays with an intensity. She's a player that will do some ridiculous things on the ice, like dab after a goal in the year 2025. Those are the things that I want to see in players that love the game of hockey, that show that on the ice, that show that game in, game out, are the players that I think are infectious to be around, are the players that can help you win games in meaningful moments. And I look at what Skylar Irving did last year at Northeastern, and she ticks a lot of the boxes that I'm looking for and the kind of player that I think can make a difference in this league. I think she's easily going to slot into a third line center role. I think she's somebody that can chip in on a second power play. I think she's somebody that can be a bit of a game breaker unexpectedly in moments this upcoming season as a rookie. It's always difficult having that rookie transition to the league. And it's not like I'm saying she's going to be a point per game or anything like that, but I think she can be a sneaky 6 to 8 goal scorer. Honestly, I think she can be in that half point per game range. And in a league that is dying for offense, that is a great get at like 20th overall. I really like what Skylar Irving brings. And if she shifts to the wing, she's somebody that could play higher in the lineup as well as a complementary player as well. I'm very high on Skylar Irving, if you couldn't tell. She's absolutely one of my gals, and with the Huskies connection, one of my dogs as well coming into this season. All right, very different kind of my gal for this next one in terms of a player that I just don't think was appreciated enough last season. And that's Alexandra Labelle, who I thought was a fantastic 4th line center for the Victoire last season. And it's weird calling her the 4th line center because in terms of average time on ice, she ranked 4th last year among all Victoire forwards. She had more average ice time over Kristen O'Neill and Abby Boreen and Maureen Murphy. Obviously in fewer games. She was injured, only had the 16 games, didn't produce a lot of offense, was injured in the middle part of the season, wasn't as effective at the end part of the season, and frankly wasn't particularly good in the playoffs. So why, saying all of that, do I have her as one of my gals? Well, it's the role she played in the early part of the regular season. It's the fact she won her 5-on-5 minutes 9-4. It's the fact that in the first season with the New York Sirens, she was a positive impact defensive player there as well. I think she's just a very valuable bottom of the lineup player that you can trust in defensive minutes, that can give you good minutes, win those 5-on-5 minutes when she's healthy. She's not going to produce a lot of offense. She might be somebody that's better suited on the wing versus at center. And yet I just think that she's a really good hockey player as just kind of 4th line extra piece. So yeah, Alexandra Labelle, one of my gals coming into the season. Again, not this kind of player that's going to wow you offensively, not this player that's maybe going to pop on the score sheet, but I think she's going to give you some good minutes. I think she's going to win her minutes more often than not. And I think when you're talking about a Victoire team that has been dying for players to trust in some of those minutes, I think you saw that throughout a lot of last season when Labelle was healthy, that she was one of those players that rose to the occasion and was trusted by Corey Cheverie. I'm very interested to see coming into the season healthy again, if she can stay healthy this season, what her role looks like over the course of this full campaign. And the third and final my gal for this group from the Victoire, Jessica DiGirolamo, who I had as the number 2 defender available in free agency behind Katie Tabin. So if you count Katie Tabin returning and then Jessica DiGirolamo there, the Victoire picking up the 2 top free agents I had on the back end in free agency this year. So why did I have DiGirolamo as the number 2 defender in free agency over somebody like a Jinsey Rose or a Callie Flanagan, some of those players? Well, for me, it's the combination of the results last season, the player profile, and the future runway developmentally. DiGirolamo, mid-20s, a player that still has a lot of room to grow. Like, you look at what Katie Tabin is at 28, going on 29 at the end of this part of the season, and in like 3-4 years' time, what can Jess DiGirolamo be? Can she be somebody like a Katie Tabin right now? I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility, because you look at DiGirolamo and the physical side of the game is immense. 41 hits last year, very physical defender that I think makes the Victoire harder to play against. But she wasn't just physical for nothing, because she was also the defender last year on the Boston Fleet that had the best 5-on-5 results in terms of winning her minutes. She won her minutes 16-10 at 5-on-5 in this kind of second pairing role primarily. Boston moved their defense around quite a bit last year. She played a lot on the right. In addition to the left, she's done that over her career. But I look at her progression from a player that played at Syracuse, not necessarily the top of mind program in college hockey. He's produced some good players, of course, but not necessarily top of mind. Has went through the PWHPA, had a very strong season there. Has now come into the PWHL, has found her groove here. And I think she's somebody that could pair perfectly on the right side or the left side with Nicole Gosling. Could even jump up on the top pairing with Ambrose if you want Katie Tabin to be paired with Nicole Gosling. And I just think that she's somebody that has a lot more room to develop, in addition to already being a very strong, in my opinion, defensive and physical presence in a top 4 on a PWHL blue line. Okay, so what's the best and worst case for this Montreal team? I think the worst case, beginning with that, is still a top 4 team in the PWHL. I don't think there's an established franchise, like I mentioned at the top, that you look the year-over-year rosters, and I think they got better, which is hard to do when you're losing 4 players in expansion, plus free agency and all of that. For me, I look at everything that the Victoire done. I think they did a better job of addressing their weaknesses in terms of bringing in players that have that higher end offensive ability to produce around the Poulins and the Staceys up front, in addition to retaining a lot of the importance on the back end by adding a couple of strong presences in DiGirolamo and Gosling, particularly in the offseason. So in terms of the worst case, like I said there, I think 4th in the league, making the playoffs regardless of the format easily. Some things like that. I think that even if things go poorly, even if Sandra Abstreiter has to step into a bigger role than expected, if anything happens with Debian, if anything happens to any of their top players, whatever it may be, I still think the worst case for this team is a top 4 team in the PWHL, which brings me to the best case. And I think the best case is still the number 1 team in the league, and the best case is Walter Cup champions. I don't know if I'm going to do any full actual season prediction post or anything like that this year, but I'll just say it at the end of this episode. The Montreal Victoire are my Walter Cup champion pick. Last year I picked the Scepters to win it over the Victoire. That obviously did not play out, but I look at the Olympic year, I look at Poulin, I look at Stacey, I look at the additions that they made, I look at the impact that Abby Roque can have on a power play in terms of what she did for the Sirens, what she can do for this group, that is going to make their offensive punch even better. I look at the depth of this team. I look at the young players on this team with potential. I look at the defensive group and how well-rounded it is. I look at ann-renee and just the stalwart that she has been the past handful of years, but particularly the last year. All of it together, I just think this team is going to be really hard to beat. And if they get beat, it's going to be because they can't score in the playoffs again, which is strange to say after everything I've said about them being a team that I believe can crack that code that they haven't been able to here in the PWHL. Sometimes some players or some teams just might be snake bitten, and it's weird to say it about a Poulin-led team, but maybe it's just the case. I don't know. Things are weird. For me, I don't think it's the case anymore. I think that they've addressed the offensive depth and having players like Roque that brings more offense. than a Kristen O'Neill, having somebody come in like a Cheyenne Darkangelo, having a lot of veterans in this group as well, and having another very good rookie class, in my opinion, and having Malinkova, who is this feisty, smaller, speedy player who can penalty kill, but chip in offensively, can play both wings, can play center, can play all around as a great complementary piece in the top six, in addition to bottom of the lineup players that can give you a bit of offense in Kath Dubois or Skylar Irving that I talked about. Maureen Murphy, one of those top players at Northeastern who hasn't really found her groove offensively, at least consistently in the PWHL, put up some good numbers in year one, has scored a couple of goals in the playoffs. I think maybe her combination with Skylar Irving could be really good. All those things to be said, they're my Walter Cup champion this year. Spoiler alert. I also haven't been right in terms of my final Walter Cup pick ever. So take that with a grain of salt. Okay, let's look at my projected lineup here, beginning with the first line. And it would be weird if I spent all episode talking about potentially splitting up Poulin and Stacey on different lines and then give it to you with Poulin and Stacey on the same line. So this is going to be a projected lineup with them on different lines in the top six, beginning with Hailey Scamurra, Marie-Philippe Poulin, and Abby Roque. I just really love the idea of this line. I think this is a line that can dominate you on the cycle, but can also really threaten in transition and on the rush. When you look at Roque and Poulin working together offensively, the forechecking ability of Hailey Scamurra, the defensive quality of Scamurra and Poulin can maybe free up Abby Roque to be more of an offensive presence. All of that, I think, is a really intriguing mix that gives you a very potent top line while still having a more spread out top six, with Laura Stacey moving to a different line. So that's what I would do for my top line in a lineup with Poulin and Stacey on different lines. Line number 2 then has Natalie Malinkova with Cheyenne Darkangelo and Laura Stacey. I think one easy change that you can make here is having Roque at center and Darkangelo on the top line on the wing. In particular, if you have Stacey still on the top line, I think Darkangelo is an intriguing fit on the top line there in that case. But for me, I like the speed and tenacity of Malinkova on a line with Darkangelo and Stacey. Stacey is so good at the shot generation. I think Malinkova is an intriguing playmaker there, and Darkangelo, given the season she had last year, I think should be in this prominent role down the middle because that's what worked so well for her last season. I think this is an intriguing mix on a line with Darkangelo down the middle with Stacey there and Malinkova. This is what I would do for my second line. Again, in a top six with Stacey and Poulin on different lines. To my third line now with Lena Youngblom with Skylar Irving down the middle and Maureen Murphy. I alluded to it very briefly earlier, but I like the Northeastern connection there of Irving and Murphy just having that history together, even though they didn't play together. Knowing each other in terms of playing on the same roster for a couple of years. I like Irving down the middle and Murphy on the wing. And then just Lena Youngblom, somebody that maybe didn't find their footing in the PWHL last year, somebody that could push into the top six, but I think somebody that gives you a very fun third line here that can maybe give you an extra couple of goals with some of the offensive talent there. And then the fourth line, Kath Dubois, Alexandra Labelle, and Jade Downey Landry, the Quebecois line, the local heroes line. I really like Alexandra Labelle at center on this fourth line with some of her defensive prowess with two more offensive players with Dubois and Downey Landry. These are players that I think can all mix around in this bottom six and give you a lot of different looks. And then I've got Caitlin Willoughby as my 13th forward here. To the back end, I'm keeping Katie Tabin and Erin Ambrose together. As mentioned earlier, in terms of being an X factor, I think Katie Tabin is a very intriguing talent coming into the season as she continues to find her groove in this league and kind of find her confidence and kind of take those steps. I've got her on the top pairing still with Erin Ambrose. She's somebody that talks so highly of Tabin, and I think they work so well in terms of their chemistry, their styles on the ice, all of it together. I think they're a pairing that you just simply keep together. And then you can go to the second pairing of Nicole Gosling and Jess DiGirolamo. I could easily flip Tabin and DiGirolamo there, but I like having these two on the second pairing and keeping the chemistry of Tabin and Ambrose on the top pairing. Nicole Gosling on a second pairing, you can maybe deploy her in some more offensive usage versus the top pairing, which is going to be eating heavy matchup minutes. And then DiGirolamo, I just really like her defensive game, that physical game, alongside a more offensive leaning defender in Nicole Gosling. And then the third pairing, Maggie Flaherty, another physical, difficult to play against player alongside Amanda Boulier on the third pairing, who has just put up some very good 5-on-5 results in the PWHL. This is a third pairing that can give you just an easy 15 minutes per game, and is a third pairing that isn't going to flash, but I think is going to be a plus third pairing around the league. So that's my top 6 for the Victoire, and then my extra defender would be Tamara Giaquinto. She's somebody that I'm actually really intrigued to see how they're used in the league this upcoming season. I didn't watch a ton of her last season at Boston University, but the clips that I was able to put together in my draft prep or I should say in the spring, the one thing that stood out about her is she has an absolute cannon of a one-timer off that left flank as the right-handed shot. I wonder if she gets into the lineup and maybe gets some sneaky power play 2-time as a big shot threat from that left flank. There's a lot of different players that can mix in on the power play, but if Giaquinto makes this roster and gets into the lineup, I wonder about her role in terms of that power play threat, in terms of that one-timer threat. And then, of course, between the pipes, ann-renee Desbiens, not going anywhere there. And then Sandra Abstreiter, who I think is a perfectly capable backup, somebody that was probably disserviced being a third-string goaltender last year. She's somebody that is going to play more in the PWHL this upcoming year than she has in her 2 seasons previous, and is deserving of that. It's great to see a player that is a starting goaltender on the international stage stay in the PWHL. I think there's a lot of value to be facing these players, even if it is in practice and you're not getting those game reps. I do think that she is going to get more game reps this year, and I'm hopeful that that helps her take her game to another level and shows the goaltenders around the world that it is the best place to be in the PWHL, even if you aren't starting 30 plus games per season. So that's going to do it for this edition of the KC Show. Thank you for tuning in. The next show will be on the reigning Walter Cup champion Minnesota Frost. So be sure to submit your questions in the comment section. If you'd like to, I will also be putting out a request for any questions on Instagram and Twitter. Once again, feel free to submit them on Discord if you're there as well. So thank you for watching or listening to this edition of the KC Show, this Montreal Victoire season preview. Again, they're my Walter Cup pick for this year. I'm very high on this group coming into the season. I think Marie-Philippe Poulin gets it done, gets her Walter Cup this upcoming season. And the Canadian in me talking, hopefully it's a double gold type of year for Marie-Philippe Poulin. So that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. And I'll catch you next time talking about the Minnesota Frost. Take care, and I'll see you next time.